Hi, I'm Becky Rose and this is part 2 of my building a city the size of my gaming table. So, if you remember before I sculpted a piece of road. I'm just going to bring that up to the camera. There you go, this is it a week later. I've actually sculpted several more now, but today we're going to make a mould. This is part 2 of the process. So I'm going to make a mould a bit like this. This is a mould of some bookcases. So to do this we're going to need some silicone and some catalyst. So let me just get these out. The technique we're going to be using is called a cavity pour. So what we've got here is some RTV general purpose silicone rubber. This is what they call a condensation cure rubber, which means you just leave it out basically. And I've got a red catalyst. There are different catalysts. I normally use blue, which results in this. And different colours mean different things. The problem I had with the blue is you mix 1 part in 20. And I found that because I was mixing quite small quantities, it was quite hard to be precise about that. So sometimes I put too much in. So if you compare the colour of these, this lower one here has far too much catalyst in. And this means I've got a load of silicone for which I haven't got catalyst. So I thought I would try moving over to the red catalyst, which is only 1 part in 10. There's apparently also a green catalyst, which is supposed to be very fast curing, sort of 6 to 8 hours time in the mould. The red and the blue are both sort of a day, so I'm going to put these in now and take them out tomorrow after work. So now that we've got our first piece, we have to make the mould. And the first kind of gotcha with the moulds is that most boxes will have a ridged bottom like this. And what that means is, when you make the mould, you get this shape. And when you pour your resin in, sometimes you pour too much in. So you scoop along the mould to clear the resin off so that the resin is flush with the top of the moulded area. But this ridge makes that impossible. So what we want to make is a mould like this, where we can just run across the top. The next kind of gotcha is that not every pot is what you want. So this is a pot here which it fits in, it's nice and flat bottomed, and that all sounds great. What we've got here is very little gap down the side, and although it fits without touching the side and would make a mould, the problem is it's going to break. There's not enough gap down the side. So what I'm going to use today is this very old oven dish. To be honest, it's past its best anyway, so I'm going to use this. Now the silicone itself is actually, it's completely inert. I've got an old tub here, which I'm just going to sort of show you what happens to it. It's kind of sticks to the container, so I'll never use that as an oven dish again. I can just, oh, it's quite rigid, there we go. Yeah, peels away, and yeah, sure, you can clean it up. And it is inert stuff. This is not toxic now that it's been moulded. You might find if you have a dog, might develop a taste for this. It's chewy and they enjoy the chewy things, right? But I would advise against encouraging your dog to do so, because they might start chewing your moulds, and they are the most expensive part to make out of all the bits we make. So you don't really want to get them in the habit. My cat's smart enough to realise this isn't food. A small child, of course, hasn't got the sense of smell, might try it. But the silicone itself is fine. However, in its liquid form, you don't really want to drink it, especially if you drink it, the silicone with the catalyst. That's going to result in it forming rubber inside you, which is not great either. So don't do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to mix them up. Now I've lost all my mixing jugs, so I'm actually going to use this old mould pot as my mixing jug. We need a set of scales, ideally digital scales. So we see we've got a mix ratio here of 10 to 1. So I'm going to zero the scales with the weight of the pot. And now I need to estimate the amount of silicon that's going to go in here. Now one of the problems I'm going to have is because I let this dry on paper, you see you've got paper underneath, the paper absorbed the moisture from the clay and wrapped up a bit, so this is not flat. And because it's not flat, that means it's going to it's going to have some burr on the mould underneath. So the mould will fill all the air that's in this pot up to the depth I pour it, and I've just got to accept the fact that I'm going to have to do some clean-up here around the edges because the silicon's going to come in underneath and sort of just leave this small area here exposed. But that's okay. Now you might be tempted to go putting in loads of other stuff in here, such as this little sort of rune-carved rock that I've made here. Notice the depth. So we want to be really careful because that's going to mean pouring the mould up to a much higher level than if I just left the road in there, and that's going to use a lot more silicon. So in this case I'm going to put some very flat models at the edge, see if there's enough room, but I'm just going to make sure I've got enough gap around, and to be honest I haven't. That's not going to, that's just going to weaken my mould. Actually, I've just found something small enough to fit. One of the guys in the office was joking that I should have some horse manure for my road, so I did sculpt some, and these are in fact small enough to just get in the edge here. So I'm going to do just that. I'll probably only make a couple of these just to answer my office-based critics. So there we go. There's room for that along the edge there, and that's sufficient distance there to not cause a problem. Now what might happen is they might float, they might lift and move. So I'm going to pour it from this end so that I'm not pouring onto here and causing it to move, because it's quite solid stuff. And if this does move over as I pour, then I will just take these out because I don't really care about them. Okay, so let's pour this silicone. I think it's going to be quite a big tub to mix in, but okay, I'm going to zero my scales. Remember, we're doing a mix ratio of 1 in 10. Now, as for how much silicone to use, you just have to kind of guess, really. So, I reckon that's got to be up to... does look different to my other silicone. I've never used this silicone or this catalyst before, and the silicone here does look different to the one I normally use. So that's, there we go, that should be sufficient. I've put in 148 grams, 149, oh, can't see it, there we go. So, I want 15 grams of this stuff, so I'm going to re-zero my scales. See how much is in a capful? Capful is 6. Okay. Oh, no, that's apparently more than 6. So 16 grams. Close enough. That always happens. I always end up using too much catalyst. And now we want to mix this in. Now, what we don't want to do is we don't want air bubbles, and that's why some people use vacuum chambers. We don't really get that choice because I haven't got one. So we're just going to mix that in. Be relatively quick about it, and I want to get this as even as possible. So go right to the edges, make sure we get every bit of catalyst. I want to make a nice even colour, which looks like it's going to come out pink. Right to the edges, make sure we get it all. I can see I've created some air bubbles, not the end of the world, there's bound to be some. And what we're going to do to try and counter the air bubbles and reduce them is we're going to use what's called the long pour method. So this is a long pour cavity mould. I've created lots of air bubbles, far too many in fact. So, very, very slowly. That's that one, there we go. Very slowly. I'm going to lift the altitude. So what I want to do is I basically want to stretch the silicone out as it pours to remove the air bubbles. So if I get globules falling down, then it will fall down with air bubbles inside it, and I don't want that. Unfortunately, from this container, it's really difficult to avoid. So the clay's holding in position very well. That's good. But I don't think I've made enough. I'm going to have to do this again. And we're just pouring to, well, if you've got a complex mould, then you pour to the deepest part of the mould. This is all about trying to get the air bubbles out. That's what we're trying to achieve here. So we don't want air bubbles. Air bubbles bad, okay? So you pour slow, pour long, and pour to the deepest part of the mould. In this case my mould's the same height, so I'm pouring at the opposite end to the little bits so that the little bits don't get moved by the weight of the silicone. And we just pour to the same place. I'm trying to sort of reach over and do the camera with my other hand. It's quite tricky. So I'm just sort of pouring onto that spot, there or thereabouts. Probably wobbled a bit as I was doing the camera. So a couple of tips. If you pour quickly, you will create a wall of silicone that will flood across your mould. Now, and obviously you may trap air bubbles. Now, I've got a few air bubbles, but nothing too serious, and some of them will rise up. They'll rise to the top of the mould. So I often pour my mould a little bit deeper than I need to anyway, just to try and get those bits to come to the surface. Trying to stop it from pulsing, but yeah, you don't want it to flood across the mould, because then the weight of the silicone could push the bits in there. Sometimes I'll glue the bits to the mould bottom if it's a disposable tub like this one, because it's disposable. I can just glue that in. Unfortunately, I've run out of flat bottom ones apart from this one, and this part doesn't fit in there. So yeah, so you don't want to flood the mould. You do want to allow a little bit of depth over the top, because you don't want your mould to tear and rip. And you also want to give a little bit of space so any air bubbles that come up don't get caught too close to the surface. That would be really bad. But basically any air bubble, if it's in the cavity you pour into, that's going to result in sort of a corruption of your sculpt. And if it's on the depth of the mould to protect, where it's meant to be protected from, then where you're pouring into, then you're weakening it, you're thinning it, so that's going to result in a weaker mould. But so generally that's your goal. It's to avoid as many air bubbles as possible, and you can give it a knock like that. Will often dislodge any air bubbles and let them start rising to the top. As I say, sometimes I glue the bits in. Another tip: don't sculpt out of polystyrene and then try to get your mould it in silicone. It doesn't work. I tried. Polystyrene sticks to the silicone. There's very few things that do, but polystyrene does. It sticks to the silicone, and it's also lighter than silicone. And it was actually, unfortunately, I probably poured it too quick, but I poured with sufficient force to break the glue on the bottom of the pieces to the mould, and I ended up with my sculptures floating on the top of the mould. So this style of moulding is good for anything that you can just sort of pour into the top, no sort of gaps like between legs on a character model or something. So I do need some more. I'm going to quickly get that happening. There we go, 59 grams. Re-zero that. So I want 6 grams of this, which is less than a capful. I tend to do the catalyst via the lid to give me a bit more control, gives me a chance to go back and pour it back in if I put too much in. So, right to the edges. Get rid of all the streaks. It's a nice even colour, then you know it's mixed. So, there we go, not quite, a few streaks there. Okay. I hope I've done enough. That's very aerated this time, so be really careful about the pour speed. Want that to be really slow. Really slow. Slower than that. Come on. Slow, slow, slow. Nice and slow. Because otherwise I'm just going to be pouring in air bubbles. Right, I'm not going to stop it from doing the odd blob down. It's quite a thick silicone. I think that's because it can be used for thixotropic moulding, which we won't get into today. I've never done it before, so I'm not about to do that. So just trying to bash out any air bubbles as it comes down, get them to rise to the top. I know I just poured a couple in there, but hopefully they'll stay a long way from any detail parts. Come on. Oh, big thick blob, didn't want that. It's coming out in too fast, slow down. Oh, my arm's killing me, and I have to swap arm. What I often do, I haven't done it this time, but I often get a second mould prepared just in case I make too much, or put too much catalyst in and then have to make some more silicone. But I haven't done that today. Certainly this 1 in 10 mix is a bit easier to get right. I don't think I allowed for the fact that the tub's at that kind of angle, so when I estimated how much extra I would need, I didn't allow for the fact that it was going to be much more because of the increased surface area as I'm coming up that dish. Always re-zero, because whilst dividing by 10 and stuff's quite easy, what I often struggle to do is, because I was doing, it's about 70, so 7 grams, and then forget the fact that it was 72, not 7. So I've just gotten into the habit of re-zeroing the scales so that I don't get muddled. It's like ectoplasm from Ghostbusters. Okay. Loads of air bubbles in this one, so just gonna... I think because it's such a big tub and such a small amount, it's getting quite a vigorous mix. So that's why it's ended up with so many air bubbles. So let's just go for a very slow pour. So some people do this with those blue sort of surgical gloves on, because if you get it on your hands, and I just did completely because I used my fingers to scoop the last out of the mould. Although it's safe, it's quite mucky. It does kind of just stick to your hands. It's hard to wash off until it starts to dry. Once it starts to set, you just peel it away, and I quite enjoy sitting in front of the telly doing that. But let me show you something else you can do with some of the worst of the air bubbles. So what I do, just with any big air bubbles, is, and some of these will probably release themselves, but I just go with a little toothpick and clear them. Because you'll only get air bubbles for a short while. Because sooner or later the silicone will get too solid for it to move through. So I've got a big one coming to the surface there. That one's huge. Burst it now. There we go. Just going for the big ones, and then bounce some more up to the top. There we go, see this one rising here? Absolutely gigantic, that one. That's probably where the corners of my piece were kind of folded up a bit. I've probably got some air trapped under there. So I'm going to take a look underneath and just check that well, to be honest, I can't actually see much because the bottom of my piece is not flat, so that didn't help. But if you've got lots of little pieces in a mould, then you kind of want to just check that they haven't moved around. Because you can sort of stick in a toothpick and move them, but the problem is you create air pockets as you do so. So you've got to... it's not advisable, but at the end of the day, if two pieces have moved together because the flow of the silicone have pushed them together, then the mould's ruined, so you may as well risk it. The thing you really want to avoid is you want to avoid the air bubbles getting trapped underneath. Now I had a road piece. If I'd have done that the other way up, which, well, would be arguably very daft for a cavity poured mould anyway, but if I had done that the other way up, then I'd be asking for trouble. I seem to be getting a lot of air out of this corner, so I'm not sure what's gone on there, so I'm just going to try and bash as much out as possible. So this is probably half hour later and something's gone very wrong. I've got these two big holes which I presume are at the edge of the piece. So I think what's happened, where the piece is curved, it's ended up with a lot of trapped air underneath, and I've ended up with a column of air to the surface of my mould. That's a problem. So I can't have a mould with a hole in, otherwise when I pour it, it's just going to pour right through. So the only thing I can do is try and pour some more silicone into there. Because I burst this bubble and that's it, it's not sealing. This is already pretty hard, I can run my finger down it. I wouldn't want to demould it yet, but I've got to do something. I can't have those holes. So I'm going to try mixing up some more and pour it down if I can. I wish I had a syringe for this, it'd be just the thing, but I'll just have to see what I can do. Because the problem is, the air that's under there comes up, and unless I put so much silicone there that I can take all the air, it's never going to work. So what I'm going to try doing is I'm going to put some paper down to plug the hole, and then I don't know what will happen with the paper once it's moulding, but I want to cover that paper with silicone and get some thickness there to protect it, because or you know, to be the bottom of the mould. I just want to stop the air from coming up. The idea is the paper covers up the air hole, and then this is going on top just to give it some thickness. Now that does mean there's an air hole from the other direction, but until I can turn the mould up and have a look, I have no idea what's in there, what's caused that. I've never had this happen before. Which I admit makes me sound a little bit like a man who's just had sex. I'm sorry, this doesn't normally happen to me. So it's now the following day after work, and you see my mould repair has now spread out across the mould. So now it's time to demould. You see my paper repair there, that looks a bit iffy, but so we're going to demould, and we do that by just easing it away from the edge. Do that over a period. Wow, this angular bowl is really hard to work with. Wow, this stuff is proper stiff. It's quite different to my normal stuff. I think I just knocked the camera there, but it's quite different to my normal stuff. This, normally it would just come away. I don't know if that's because I used a glass bowl rather than plastic or something. So I'm going to get my modelling knife. Okay, I'm just going to cut it away from the glass at the very edge here. Just going to make a little seam that for me to pull from. No, that's not enough. Oh, it does not want to demould. Seriously, I've never known anything like this stuff. Let's get a different blade than this. How much of that is the angle of this bowl and how much of it's the silicone or the fact that it's glass and I normally use plastic, I don't know. This just doesn't want to come. Zoom out a touch. Oh, is any part of this mould gonna not go wrong? Let's do this all the way around. Just break its seal with the glass. I thought silicone was only supposed to stick to silicone. Oh, so nearly got purchased. Yes, got purchased. Come on. Yeah, just be careful not to tear it. And lift, but not tear. Just break that bond all the way around. Nearly there. And we'll see what on earth went wrong with this mould with those air bubbles. Moment of truth. Now, my small clay bits stayed behind, though some of them seem to have broken up in the mould, which isn't good. And this is the burring I was talking about earlier. I was expecting this. So, just going to cut that away. Now, I don't want to cut beyond the edge of where the piece is, so I have to be quite careful as to where that piece ends. So I've got quite a bit more I can get there. It looks like my cray is cracked, which is a bit worrying. Although that could be where I was removing it from the mould. Could have got a bit of flex in there, which the clay won't take. Okay, let's see if we can get that out now. I can see the clay breaking up as I try and lift it out. Oh, it's stuck to the silicone. That's okay. The piece is trashed, the original sculpt. I wasn't expecting that at all. Oh dear. So, well, as I said before, this is the first time I've worked with clay, and this is the first time I've used red catalyst and this particular brand of silicone. So I don't know which part of that is what's gone wrong here, but this is not how it normally happens. This is terrible. I was hoping to show you how easy moulding was. That was the goal. When I started this little project, it's going to be like, right, moulding and casting so easy. The only bit I don't know is the sculpting. As it turns out, the sculpting was fairly easy, and it's the moulding that's proven to be a real challenge. Wow, what a disaster. What do we do with the rest of the bits? I have no idea. It looks like, I mean, from what I can see of the detail in the mould, that appears to have come out nice. It's just that it's covered in clay. Broken up clay that's stuck to the silicone. I really wasn't expecting that at all. What I'm going to try do, I think, is I'm going to try running it underwater, see if the clay reacts with the water, softens up a bit, and maybe I can then just pour it out. Oh, on the floor. So I've got the big chunks out, but now there's a load of clay in there that, well, I just don't want that there. And I'm curious as to what's happened with my corners, so what did go wrong? And you know what? I can't see a hole. That's where one of the bits of paper was. I can't see a hole there. And the other one was at this end. So around about there. And I don't see a hole there. So I don't know where those air bubbles came from, but apparently there's somewhere between the top of my piece and the surface of the mould. So I maybe panicked over nothing, although they did look like really deep tunnels, so maybe I filled them when I did that repair. So I'm going to try running this under the tap, see if that loosens up the clay. Well, I would describe that as only marginally effective, to be honest. It hasn't really affected the consistency of the clay at all. It just helped wash some of the looser bits away. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to cast it, because the resin is quite sticky. So what should happen is when I pull this out, when I take the first piece out, it should, hopefully, bring away a lot of that clay. That's my theory. I don't know if that's right. I've never had clay in a mould before. I've had some paint in my mould dish before, and then that's it. That's it. That's the worst I've had. Because, you know, well, the silicone itself's pretty strong, so it shouldn't affect the quality of... sorry, I shouldn't be breaking that, but yeah, this is... well, I'm going to need to let it dry now before I do anything. What I can do, though, is I can trim up a bit neater to the edges, because that will make it easier to remove the resin piece when I do so. I'll just take away some of the lip off the edge, some of the burr. So the unevenness of the bottom of the piece has made for quite a thick mould ceiling. So this area here is much thicker than I normally get, and I think that's because the piece was so uneven. So when we pour this, we might find that the resin comes up to this level. You know, I was talking about earlier with sweeping across. I think that might be an issue with this mould, because of how thick this is. Because I don't want to pour into this level and make the bottom of the piece this shape, you know, all jaggedy and cut away and stuff. Drop a bit. So, crikey, I'm going to get this out. I've got so many more pieces to cast as well. Right, so we'll see what happens. I think it's the only thing for it. We'll cast it, we'll see if this resin comes away, and the first one will probably just be a discard, to be honest. I don't see it being much use. Well, it might be usable, because, I mean, at the end of the day, it's just going to have a slightly different pattern. It's not the end of the world. So we'll see what happens. But that's going to be in part 3.